Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Phil Klay, author of the short story collection Redeployment, winner of the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction. Klay served in Iraq's Anbar province from January 2007 to February 2008 as a public affairs officer with the U.S. Marine Corps. Following his service, he earned an MFA from Hunter College. Klay gave a talk and a reading at the U of O on May 21, 2015, as a guest of the Veterans and Family Student Association, a UO student organization that offers support to veterans and strives to educate both the public and student body about the personal sacrifices made by the nation's veterans. Thanks, Phil, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
The volume is titled Redeployment. That's the title of the opening story, about a war vet who has recently returned from the war in Iraq. Why did you choose that title for that opening story and for the volume?
Well, the opening story is actually the first story that I started writing. I started it a couple months after I got back from Iraq. Well, I mean, the word has a particular kind of resonance for me. It set up a lot of the concerns. Redeployment is when you deploy a unit back, but people will refer to their own personal redeployments. So I redeployed from Iraq in February of 2008. It also, I liked the notion of redeployment. This is all volunteer military, of the sense of doing it again. And it was very important to me, not just sort of what happens overseas, but what happens when you come back. What does America look like? What happens when you come back and go over again and come back again over time?
Would you be willing to read a passage?
Absolutely.
Tell us what you're going to, where it's from, and anything you'd like to tell us about it.
Well, I'll read from that first story. So the book's all different narrators. A chaplain, a foreign service officer. This one is from an infantryman who served in the Second Battle of Fallujah. And this is his first weekend home. So here's an experience. Your wife takes you shopping in Wilmington. Last time you walked down a city street, your Marine on point went down the side of the road, checking ahead and scanning the roofs across from him. The Marine behind him checks the windows on the top levels of the buildings. The Marine behind him gets the windows a little lower, and so on down until your guys have the street level covered. And the Marine in back has the rear. In a city, there's a million places they can kill you from. It freaks you out at first, but you go through like you were trained, and it works. In Wilmington, you don't have a squad, you don't have a battle buddy, you don't even have a weapon. You startle 10 times checking for it, and it's not there. You're safe, so your alertness should be at white, but it's not. Instead, you're stuck in a American Eagle Outfitters. Your wife gives you some clothes to try on, and you walk into the tiny dressing room. You close the door, and you don't want to open it again. Outside, there are people walking around by the windows like it's no big deal. People who have no idea where Fallujah is, where 3 members of your platoon died. People who spent their whole lives at white. They'll never get even close to orange. You can't until the first time you're in a firefight, or the first time an IED goes off that you missed. And you realize that everybody's life, depends on you not screwing up. And you depend on them. Some guys go straight to red. They stay like that for a while, and then they crash, go down past white, down to whatever's lower than, I don't care if I die. Most everybody else stays orange all the time. Here's what orange is. You don't see or hear like you used to. Your brain chemistry changes. You take in every piece of the environment, everything. I could spot a dime in the street 20 yards away. I had an antenna out that stretched down the block. It's hard to even remember exactly what that felt like. I think you take in too much information to store, so you just forget. Free up brain space to take in everything about the next moment that might keep you alive. And then you forget that moment too, and focus on the next, and the next, and the next, for 7 months. So that's orange. And then you go shopping in Wilmington, unarmed, and you think you can get back down to white? It'll be a long time before you're down to white.
Thank you. Wonderful. That particular kind of experience, and there's a number of stories that are interested in that experience and the experience of the vet back home and the radical disorientation the vets feel because people are shopping, as if war? There's no war. That particular problem seems a major problem for a number of the speakers in the
Yeah.
volume, but it also seems a kind of problem that you were addressing when you wrote the book. Is that the case?
Right. I think, when people, a lot of times when people talk about a veteran having difficulty coming back, oftentimes the conversation gets flattened just to trauma, right? Whereas I think for a lot of people, there's an almost, one, there's just the conflict of the different cultures that you're in, but there's also a moral issue, right? I was not an infantryman, I was a staff officer. I had a relatively safe job in a very dangerous place. But when I, midway through my deployment, came home for 2 weeks of leave, the military will fly you anywhere in the world. One of the Marines I work with, was a base jumper, went to Switzerland and went base jumping. I went home to see my friends and family. And there's a level 2 trauma facility nearby where I lived in Iraq, and there's just always having injured people coming in. And I'd seen a Marine die in that level 2 trauma facility, and other people come in and be injured. And then, within a week of that experience, I'm walking down Madison Avenue in the summer. There's no public sense that we're at war. Of course, the political decisions that we make here, whether active political decisions like who we vote for, or passive ones like not to vote at all or not to pay attention, those are directly related to what's happening overseas. And it's very hard to wrap your head around how those two things are happening at the same time and feel so disconnected.
In some sense, you're hoping that this book steps into that breach, fills that gap somehow, yes?
Right. I wanted to write a book that invited people to imagine the experience of veterans, right? Empathetically, not uncritically, right? Not to just sort of listen sympathetically to what a veteran has to say and then that's it, but to actually engage with, a kind of diverse array of voices. I didn't want, one coherent narrative coming back telling you this is the truth of war. I wanted a variety of stories that would hopefully rub up against each other. Narrators who wouldn't necessarily get along or agree with each other, but hopefully would provide the reader with some space for thought and reflection.
Every story is narrated from the first person by
Yes.
a different narrator. Some of them are grunts. As you said, there's chaplains, there's foreign service officers. And you've given a good sense of the importance of that range of voices. You chose to write fiction.
Right.
You are a vet. You could certainly have written a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? Say a little bit more about, from your perspective, why fiction was the right way to go.
For me, it's better. I mean, what I just talked about, stepping into these different skulls, you can only do that in fiction, right? That kind of empathetic act, which is, I think, really important for thinking things through. The fiction allows you different tools, and it allows you're not constrained by actual circumstance. You can manipulate circumstance, that you can really look at what it is that you have on your mind, the things that are troubling you or confusing you, or that just, the things that stay with you that you want to look at from other angles. You can manipulate the events in a story to put those characters under pressure, and then you have to make those characters realistic and fully fleshed out, and then you see what they do. So every time I wrote a story, I'd start with, oftentimes I'd have a kind of fixed notion of how this was going to be, and the characters inevitably sort of take a pickaxe to all your ideas about the world. There's nothing against memoir, right? But there's the truth of the event, and then there's the sort of emotional truth. With fiction, it's a given that, it didn't actually happen. Even it may be related to things that happened. So, that emotional truth, that's what you have to zero in on. The example I always throw out is the Iliad, right? If you had a Trojan War vet and you had him read the Iliad, I mean, if you think modern vets tear apart Hollywood movies, he would just rip it to shreds. This guy didn't even know how we fought. We didn't use those weapons. He doesn't know how we use chariots, right? But thousands of years since that, veterans of many, many, many wars have read that and felt like that articulated something very true and vital about the experience of warfare, even as, technology and tactics and culture has changed.
I was going to ask you, you've just described all the benefits from the perspective of the author. What do you think are the benefits from the perspective of the reader? And you basically just explained it right then. I'm an English prof, and I often say fiction is truer than truth. And this is a perfect example. When you read this, the feeling that you're getting a window onto truths is really powerful for the reader.
I also think it sets the thing aside. If I was writing this, if I was writing about real people,
Mm-hmm.
I would be writing about someone who died knowing that their family was going to read it. Mm-hmm. I would be writing about difficult situations. I would feel constrained by my obligations to the real people,
Mm-hmm.
Which would make it, for me personally, harder to have the freedom to go in any direction that I felt I needed to go. And I think that also affects how something is read from the perspective of the reader.
No doubt.
I talked to a chaplain who said he had other military chaplains read Prayer in the Furnace.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons he said is because you talk about a unit that has crossed ethical lines, right? It's something that can happen in war. But if you start to bring up real stories, people get very quiet.
Well, in that story, that moment, actually, you portray that moment when the chaplain gives the sermon, the very powerful sermon, and the few soldiers who have come to hear it he can see.
Yeah.
And they literally get very, very quiet.
Right.
Which is one of the things it's an amazing story. That's an amazing story. I wanted to ask you about research. You've talked about emotional authenticity and a kind of truth to experience, and how fiction allows you to access or to express truths that you might be inhibited. The sense of difference between these individuals. I mean, they're very distinctive voices, and there's some experiences that feel so real. I'm just wondering what kind of research you did to imagine these different people.
Talked to vets, read a lot of books. They're kind of, I guess, 3 layers of research. So when I think about how I do it, there's research where you're looking for factual details, right? What type of NVGs did they use in 2004, and what did it look like, right? And at a certain point, I know I can't know everything, and it's, I'm probably going to get some minor things wrong, but I want to do everything I can to get those factual details right, because they matter, right? It's not just, soldiers, Marines, there can be a lot of emotional weight that is invested in equipment. To, Marine who served in Vietnam, when the M16 was introduced, the difference between M16 and M14, it's not just a one digit, right? So, and also sort of that factual research complicates your understanding of the people and worlds that you're talking about. And I always want to read enough till I've got a sort of mass of details that I can draw from, but also where I feel free to be able to make stuff up, right? Because if I've got a little bit of research, I'll just use like the 5 things that I know, and then I'll create dead and lifeless fiction. Then there would be sort of books that aren't necessarily going to give me factual details. Maybe I'm reading The Good Soldier Shrek, right, which is a Czech novel written by an anarchist about World War I. When I'm writing Money is a Weapon System, right, which, you know, kind of gave me some of the text. Or maybe I'm reading, for the Chaplin story, Diary of a Country Priest, which is a beautiful, beautiful book. It was very important for me when I was writing that. So there's that sort of thing, and then there's also like the, you know, kind of technique. Reading Nathan Englander's stories, thinking like, how did he structure this, and what tools of fiction can I steal from him or from Patrick McGrath that will help me, you know, achieve the kind of effects that I want in the book.
I want to talk a little bit about technique. One thing that's striking, I think, for readers who are not vets is the language, and in particular, its profanity. But also, the other thing that's really striking about it is the acronyms.
Right.
And as the one story is basically all acronyms. It's only 5 pages long, it's all acronyms. The effect of reading that for someone who is not a vet, you're reading these acronyms, and you know, a couple of them you know. You certainly can spend an hour on Wikipedia or searching the web and decode every one of them.
Can't get every one of them.
Can't get every one of them. So I wanted to talk about that, your understanding of the power, and it's obviously a distinct power between the profanity on the one hand and the acronyms on the other. I said, why not give me a glossary of these acronyms? Say a little bit about that.
You know, I actually discussed that with my editor, Andrea Walker, and she was like, I don't think we should have a glossary. And I was like, I don't want it either. And I didn't want people, I knew that some people would, but I didn't want people going on Google and trying to figure out what every acronym was. You know, I said in OIF, one of the acronyms, you'd know if you were a member of a particular National Guard unit that used that acronym to refer to a particular town, right? But it's not on Google. There's some things the internet doesn't know. And not every Marine understands every acronym. Actually, few Marines understand all the acronyms in that story, because there's military culture, and then there's all these little subdivisions. It was very important to me that civilian readers be able to read the stories and understand them. But that doesn't mean understanding every acronym. I would have, I had civilian readers. One of my good friends, Lauren Holmes, who wrote a book called Barbara the Slut, which is coming out soon. I think my book is one of the few military books that she has ever willingly read. She, read every story in draft and gave me feedback, I'd give her stories like that, and I'd say, I know you're not going to know, but can you understand the emotional arc? There are 2 stories, most of the stories you can read, there are not that many acronyms. There are 2 stories that have a lot, Frago and OIF. No accident that acronyms are the titles of each of those. Frago is the second story, and the heaviest amount of acronyms are on the first page. And I wanted that. I wanted somebody to get through the first story, which is, I think, much more open to a civilian reader for a variety of reasons, not just in the language, but also I think it's a kind of more familiar war story. And then you flip the page, and here's this just slew of acronyms, just on a visual level, looking at the page. It's a different culture, and it's very important. And I wanted that sense of alienation. I wanted that right up front. The narrator uses acronyms a little differently in OIF, and there's the language can be used to obscure things. It can be used emotively. There's a rhythm to it, and for a veteran of Iraq or Afghanistan, IED, the acronym, has a lot more emotive force than improvised explosive device, which is what it refers to. And so it was important to me to think about that language, to really highlight it. OIF is only 3 pages. I didn't want to, I didn't want to make any chores for the reader. I wanted it to be very accessible. But But it was very important for me to look at that and have the reader look at that and think about that language and its relationship to the culture on its own right as a way of hopefully informing the other stories in the collection.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting to think about there's some kind of relationship between the reader's experience of an alien culture that uses different language and the soldier's experience of the alien culture that they're encountering that's using different language. I mean, the translator in The Money Story, the professor,
right?
A fascinating character who is, a highly educated, he's a professor and he's got this job, which he clearly hates the Americans, but he's also obviously has contempt for many of the Iraqis that he's translating from. And our narrator, who is this Foreign Service guy, who, I mean, that's your sort of catch-22 story, isn't it? It's sort of like a confrontation.
It's the most satirical, yeah, for sure.
The most absurdist. But the language is amazing. But say a little bit about the profanity, the importance of the profanity. I mean, when the passage you read, you
I
Baldwerized it. And it's, for various reasons, I appreciate that. But the profanity is so crucial in these stories.
I mean, there are two things. One is, you have to, if I'm going to write, these stories, what right do I have to tell these stories? I don't have a right to tell the stories. I don't think anybody has a right to tell a story. The only way you justify it is by being as rigorous and honest as you can. And that goes down just to the level of language. How would these characters actually talk? Some of them use substantially more profanity than others, right? The chaplain doesn't go around cursing all the time. But one, profanity is a part of the culture. That's a simple explanation. But two, if you're talking about war, you're talking about young guys joining the military, going in 18, 19, if they're officers going in a little older, but still early 20s, then they go overseas and they're experiencing things that are frankly, they're profane, right? Seeing poverty and suffering is profane. Seeing the death of your friends is profane. Going into a torture house and seeing two guys who've been tortured half to death and had drills taken through their ankles is profane. And if you are trying to search for a language to actually describe that, you're not doing your job unless you're using language that makes the audience squirm.
Well, that's how it works in the stories for certain. And I mean, how are you going to communicate the profanity of this place, this spectacle, to people that are not in a profane place? That's one of the tools, it seems to me, that makes it work.
And it's the level of language, it's the level of things. I certainly had a kind of hesitation when I wrote stories like in Vietnam they had whores, right? But I don't think that you don't deal with something by pretending it doesn't exist. And it's the things that we don't want to look at that are often the most important too.
Ah, yes. Did you have any sense that this book would take off the way it did?
I did. I was not expecting all this. It's been incredible, It's been. It's been very wonderful. I always wanted this to be something. It was, it's my offering to a conversation about war that I felt was really lacking when I came home. And, there's a lot more literature by both veterans and civilians, some excellent books written by civilians as well about the wars, that I think have sort of moved the conversation about these issues forward. And I'm really grateful for the response that I've had and the conversations that I've been able to have with people about it.
You came back and you decided to pursue an MFA at Hunter College.
I
did. Talk about that decision and also not only about the decision, but also about the experience of finding yourself in a university classroom studying fiction. What was that like?
So I with the new GI Bill, which I think is a great thing, and my plan was to to do an MFA because the writing was very important to me, and then go on and do something else. I later was briefly in a master's education program, and I public taught for half a year to a public or student taught for half a year to public middle school. I got out of the Marine Corps and went right to Hunter, which was incredible. I really wonderful fellow students. It was also very useful to me to be, I was in a vet writing workshop at NYU that I went to on the weekends, which was really good, and met a lot of tremendous writers there. And then also to have civilian readers reading the work and providing me different types of feedback. And there were really strong writers. I already mentioned Lauren Holmes and Bill Chang, who wrote Southern Cross the Dog, and Scott Cheshire, who wrote High as the Horse's Bridles, and Chris Robinson were very important readers for me. And studied with Colin McCann, Peter Carey, Nathan Englander, Patrick McGrath, Claire Massoud. It was it was a remarkable thing. It was also a very different culture. The way that a Marine might express his opinion that would not raise any eyebrows among Marines was a little different from the way that you do it in MFA. So I had to smooth down some of my rougher edges, and actually I early on there was a class where I had strong opinions, and the next day Bill Chang was like, "Hey, you want to grab lunch?" And it's like, maybe if you tone it down a little. But it was great. I mean, it was I think there's always a sort of odd transition whenever you leave one culture and go to another, whether it's being at school and going into the workforce, or being in the Marine Corps and doing anything that's not the Marine Corps.
Well, thank you so much for not smoothing the rough edges in the volume. Thank you so much for talking to us today and for that amazing piece of writing. It's tremendously powerful, and I really think it will help to advance the cause for which you wrote it.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I've been speaking with Phil Klay, Iraq War veteran and author of the short story collection Redeployment, winner of the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction. Klay gave a talk and a reading at the U of O on May 21st, 2015, as a guest of the Veterans and Family Student Association. Thanks so much for watching.